Let's return to that tree-lined boulevard in Richmond with its 7 Confederate statues.
They sit without irony.
This is Michael Paul Williams, a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
People must visit Richmond and say, don't they know they lost?
When Robin Williams came, did you hear what he said?
No.
He drove down Monument Avenue and he said, "I don't think I've ever seen quite so many second-place trophies in my life." Williams grew up in segregated Richmond and lived through the city's racial turmoil in the 1960s. He says that some of these tensions played out on Monument Avenue.
There was actually a movement in the 1960s to expand Monument Avenue by 7 additional Confederate monuments, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
It wasn't clear exactly who would be honored. And in fact, I think at least one Times-Dispatch or News Leader editorial questioned, well, where will we get these 7 additional folks? But just the idea that this was, even in the late 1960s, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, that this was of potential insult to the African-American community did not seem to occur to anyone.
So do you think this was a reaction to the Civil Rights Movement? This is sort of the white South playing offense?
I could not dispel that because, frankly, that what happened on Monument Avenue was a reaction to the first Reconstruction.
Right.
So it stands to reason that, there would be reaction after the Civil Rights Movement and the approval of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, in this sense that something is slipping away.
The statues on Monument Avenue have stood untouched for a century. But in 1996, the city did add a statue of African-American tennis champion Arthur Ashe, who grew up in Richmond. 2 years ago, Michael Paul Williams wrote a column saying it was time to remove the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue. Williams was moved to publish that editorial after a white supremacist murdered 8 African-American people at a church in Charleston, South Carolina.
It was kind of an aha moment. We can't, as a nation, wade through the contradiction of a Confederate imagery in the public sphere and profess to be a freedom-loving nation.
Williams thinks the monuments belong in a museum. He would like to see new monuments of African-American heroes, such as abolitionist Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner, who led a failed rebellion of enslaved people.
If you're going to tell the entire story of Monument Avenue and Confederacy and Virginia history, you've got to include those who fought for their freedom, the oppressed and enslaved who fought for their freedom. One man's leader of a bloody slave revolt is another man's freedom fighter. And we if we're going to value life, we've got to acknowledge that life is equal, and we have to add balance to the story.
And the South is much more than just the Confederacy.
This is UCLA historian Brenda Stevenson. She grew up in Virginia during the era of segregation.
When you look around in the South and you see the monuments and the highways and the schools and the namings that I'm saying of these events, you would think that from 1607 until, 2015, that this was the Confederacy. Not just from 1861 to 1865.
Stevenson says debates over Confederate monuments aren't just about the past. They're also about the present.
And so within the context of African Americans feeling as if economically we are taking steps back, within the criminal justice system that we are taking steps backwards. And so, this debate about the Confederate monuments really comes within this really broader context.
And those monuments are a manifestation of the symbolism that created the world we live in today.
Michael Paul Williams is a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. We also heard from historians Brenda Stevenson at UCLA and Mari McInnes at the University of Texas, Austin.